this video I want to share my experience how it was shooting an old school Leica-R lens, and this is a perspective correction lens. I come into details in a moment, on one of the most modern DSLM camera bodies you currently get on the market, namely the Fuji GFX 100. And everything I'm saying here applies in the same way to the brand new Fuji GFX 100S. I will get my 100S in the next few days, and then of course I will be back on my channel sharing my experiences. But as a rule of thumb, the new GFX 100S is basically a GFX 100 with a few modifications, for instance when it comes to the electronic viewfinder, but in a much more compact camera body, and so a very desirable value proposition, of course, since this is clearly one of the best cameras in the world as of today. The game plan for the video is as follows. First, I will quickly reintroduce that lens. Since people following me on my channel have seen this lens before, I will keep this short. And then second, I want to show how it was shooting with that lens in Zurich and how the lens is operated. And then third, I will look into images and results, and of course demonstrate that this combo is a very good combo for architecture and all kinds of applications in photography. And now let's kick off the video. Let's have a quick look at the lens now, and let's get the electronic viewfinder away for that. I don't think we need that here for the time being. And looking at the lens here, I rotate this a little bit. So we have a PC-SUPER-ANGULON lens, and it's from the Leica R mount series here. You see the R here, its widest open aperture is 2.8 and the focal length is 28mm. And as I said, I've reviewed this lens before on my channel. If you want to get more details, look it up. In general, it's a very nice lens. And maybe to provide some background I didn't share in the last video is the following. This lens was manufactured in 1991, and its overall optical construction actually comes from Schneider Kreuznach and not from Leica. And Leica rebranded it and equipped it with the Leica R mount to fit it to the Leica R camera bodies. And so we talk here about a give or take 30-year-old lens, which still, as you will see in the live shooting later, performs quite well on these high-resolution sensors in modern DSLMs. If I rotate this a little back to the beginning of the label of the lens, the PC here stands for perspective control. You could very likely also say perspective correction. And the way you control this is by this knob here. And this is a shift lens, so you can shift this in both directions. You also see on the scale that you have about 11mm of headroom, but don't forget this lens is calculated for full frame sensors, and the Fuji GFX 100 has a cropped medium format sensor, which means it's significantly larger than full frame, but not as large as the so-called full medium format like you find it in various Hasselblad and Phase 1 cameras. Fuji actually calls this type of medium format large format. And since this is calculated for full frame, which is a smaller sensor size, if you get very close to the 10mm, say here from 8mm on, you will see some vignetting in the corners, because despite the fact that the image circle of that lens is large enough to be shot on a larger sensor like this large format sensor here, it's still not large enough to fully avoid any vignetting, and you will clearly see this, and will also see this in the sample images. But you can fairly well go in both directions up to 7-8mm and then still have good options to correct the vignetting in post, as I will demonstrate. And in general, the lens works very well even on the larger sensor, which is larger than full frame in this GFX 100. Here I was shifting in the horizontal direction, which is for instance good for panorama stitching, but you can also rotate this here and then transform it into a vertical shift. And this is what I will use in my demonstration later in the live shooting. This is typical for avoiding falling lines in architecture and correcting the perspective physically on the lens instead of later in post, and in this way not wasting any sensor area and sensor space and resolution, of course. The build quality of the lens is beyond any doubt. The focus ring is buttery smooth, as I demonstrated in my last video on that lens. The aperture ring is fantastic. Top Leica quality like always, despite the fact that the optical construction originally comes from Schneider Kreuznach. And for a 30-year-old lens, I think the performance of this lens on one of the highest resolution sensors you can get today in the system camera market is just absolutely remarkable in my opinion. What I want to do next is I will take this lens outside, will demonstrate in a live shooting how it is to operate that lens on the Fuji GFX 100 body, and then we look into some sample images in post-processing and will basically confirm that the quality of images of this lens combined with this 100 megapixel sensor on the GFX 100 camera body is a very good value proposition, of course. And remember, everything I'm saying here is applying to the brand new GFX 100S in the same way, since the mounted technology, the sensor is all absolutely the same in terms of resolution and all the specs you expect. As a last remark, this is the adapter I use to mount this Leica-R lens to my Fuji GFX 100, and as I said, works in the same way, of course, on the GFX 100S. The connection between the lens and the camera body is very solid with that adapter, as you can see here. And the only thing is you have a fully manual workflow in shooting, but that's given anyway by the manual workflow you get with this Leica-R lens, where you control everything on the lens, like the aperture, the focus, and so on. Focusing the lens is super easy, and you also have all the focusing aids on the camera body. Here you see the scene in front of the camera without shifting the lens, and that's a pretty boring image because nothing interesting is going on in that white foreground here, so we have to correct this. Here we see the same scene, but now with applied vertical shifting on the lens in front of the camera, so we don't get falling lines, but we also drastically reduced that boring empty foreground we had on that particular place here. Here we now take a second shot, and then we are going to look at them in post to compare the two images and see the effect of the shift lens. You also see here in the upper corners, left hand side and right hand side, the vignetting kicking in, which is based on what I said at the beginning of the video. The image circle of that Leica-R lens is large enough to allow it to be shot on that larger sensor, but if you shift it more than 7-8 millimeters, you see significant vignetting kicking in, which can be later corrected in post, of course. What I also wanted to try is the Multishot mode on the GFX 100, and that can be adjusted with a mode dial on the upper left hand side of the camera, and then you scroll down through all kinds of options until you reach Pixel Shift Multishot. And looking here with my smartphone through the electronic viewfinder, you see how the camera is now taking 16 consecutive shots, and I will show in a moment very quickly how to process them in post with dedicated software from Fujifilm to stack these images for an all-in 400 megapixel resolution image. That's the program I use for it, Fujifilm Pixel Shift Combiner, and you basically register the job. Doing so, you find the folder where the 16 frames are, and then if you found that folder, you can mark them all, select them all, and then basically click open, and the software will then take in these 16 frames, and you see here a progress bar saying combining and stacking these images to a 400 megapixel RAW file. The first image I wanted to show is from that live demonstration scene on that very famous place in Zurich. You see on the left hand side the image at 28 millimeters focal length without application of a vertical shift, and on the right hand side it's shifted, and of course looks then much better from the representation of the scene in front of the camera. The light was difficult at that day because the foreground was always in the shadow and the background was in the light, and I did not invest here time to post-process these images at this point in time, because that's not what this video is about, of course. And the only adjustments I did was basically pushing the auto button on the Lightroom settings, and here on the right hand side where I shifted, trying to compensate for that strong vignetting the original had when it came out of camera. And I want to quickly show that by looking at the shifted image in the develop section of Lightroom, and then you see here on the left hand side the original as it came out of camera. It's the RAW file, of course, and on the right hand side you see some vignetting correction applied, but it's not perfect, and I overdid it here. I shifted to the max to, let's say, 10 millimeters give or take, to get the full height of this church tower into my scene. And my recommendation actually is, since this Leica lens is calculated for a full frame sensor, it's already fantastic that you can shoot it on a large format sensor, but don't overdo the shifting. Stick to, let's say, 7-8 millimeters and don't go up to 10 millimeters, because then the vignetting will be very hard to correct in post. Here's another example of a gate in front of a very famous restaurant downtown Zurich, and this is the version without a vertical shift, and here is the version with the vertical shift. And again, I got rid of that foreground. If something would be here in the middle of that foreground, I think then this image would become more interesting. But in this way, it's actually just centering the door in the middle of the frame, which is not super interesting. And here I think it looks much better, because you also get a glimpse behind the door in the vertical direction, which you don't have here, of course. Now, looking into that image and cropping in by 200%, not 100%, 200% indeed here, it's absolutely mind-blowing what level of sharpness is produced here in combination of that 30-year-old Leica-R lens on the Fuji GFX. And you see so many details in that image. So the focus was sitting on that gate here, but you also see so many details in the background here. If you look through the gate, quite remarkable what you see. And I think if I go down to the borders here, let's do this, even here to the border or the end of the image at the bottom, it's still absolutely sharp at 200% crop. So there's nothing to complain. And if we go up here, let's say to here, we still have, clearly there is a depth of field issue in the far background here, but it is absolutely remarkable how sharp that lens performs on the Fuji GFX. Looking a little bit to the left-hand side and the right-hand side, let's start with the left-hand side, maybe here. Again, you get an amazing level of detail here. This is super crisp and super sharp. I'm really excited about it. There is even this tiny little screw here, which you see. And it's, in my opinion, absolutely mind-blowing. Let's go to the right-hand side for a moment. Let's look at that grid here. And here you see a little bit of softness coming in, but still a very good level of sharpness. If you look into the window and the structure here in the glass, pretty impressive. I'm pretty convinced that this is a very good value proposition to shoot old Leica-R lenses on Fuji GFX cameras. I don't want to make this video overly long, but I could not resist the temptation to at least show one example where I put side by side, as I do here, on the left hand side the single shot from that scene we just discussed, and on the right hand side the multi-shot of that same scene, but with 400 megapixels now. And clearly we have now to take this into account when zooming in. So let's go to the left hand side, the single shot, let's zoom in by 400%, and let's see what we get. So let's go to the center of that gate here, where we have a lot of structure and details. And going to the multi-shot on the right hand side, I now go in by 200% crop. And let's see what we get here. So if you look at that and compare these two images now, it's absolutely amazing how much better the right hand side is. So with that multi-shot feature, pixel shift based, which the GFX cameras, the 100 and the 100S are offering, you can significantly increase resolution, and as a side award, get more clarity, better structure and details, and an overall better image representation. So that works, of course, also with these Leica-R lenses, because the actual frames taking when you do the shooting, they only have 100 megapixels, but it's 16 of them, and then they get stacked together in post, as I demonstrated before. But if you compare these images, it's mind-blowing what you can achieve with the multi-shot feature on these GFX 100 and GFX 100S cameras here. I want to come to an end with my review here, but want to show two more examples which illustrate how useful it is to have a shift lens. And here you see a door for one of the famous churches in Zurich. And if I do not shift in the vertical direction, I get this very unfortunate representation here on the left-hand side, with a lot of meaningless foreground and actually cutting off the door at just, you know, the angle or field of view I have at 28 millimeters. Whereas if I do a vertical shift like I did here on the right hand side, I get the full representation of the door, and I also have less foreground. And clearly these are the main advantages. Of course, also avoiding falling lines, all these kind of things. Panorama stitching, which can help you a lot if you have a shift lens, in particular, since you can, as I showed at the beginning, rotate this lens in a way that you can do vertical shifting, but also horizontal shifting. So you can create nice panorama stitchings. And that these kind of 30-year-old lenses work so well on these modern high-resolution sensors is just a gift, and I think something we should enjoy and appreciate. Here another quick example, and unless you want to have for a certain expression that white empty foreground on the left hand side where I did not apply a vertical shift, it's clearly a better image on the right hand side where you have the right proportions between the blue sky, the big church in the background, the bridge in the foreground, and also luckily here some people moving and crossing that bridge. So the shift lens again played nicely with that camera and produced a quite nice image from downtown Zurich. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up as an appreciation of my work. I hope you liked that review. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. There's always more to come, and in the meanwhile, stay safe and healthy, and peace out.